Thank you. So, Director Division of Watershed Management, these programs with wastewater and residuals management are both under my supervision. And so I want to give you today just a bit of overview about reasons that MassDEP is engaged in this effort to evaluate residuals PFAS content. Stephanie has certainly done a good job of that already. But I also want to talk to you a little bit about the residuals program, sort of introduce some terms and sort of the way that DEP is involved with residuals management in the Commonwealth, so that as we proceed as a group, a stakeholder group, that we'll have some common knowledge, common terms, and an understanding of just what where DEP intersects with residuals management. Next slide, please. So as most of you know, we are concerned about PFAS because they do represent some significant health risks. They have some properties that cause particular concern for infants and fetuses. The ability of PFAS compounds to cross the placenta and to be expressed in breast milk are both of concern for fetuses and infants. They have toxic effects, developmental effects, effects on the immune system, can result in endocrine disruption, effects on the liver, and can elevate cancer risks for certain types of cancer. As Stephanie's talked about a bit, they are very persistent in the environment. They are difficult to get rid of once created, hard to break down, hard to destroy, and they are water soluble, which makes them pretty mobile in the environment. We know that they move readily through soil, into groundwater, into surface water, and travel at great distance. So this makes them, you know, a class of compounds that we are concerned about. Next slide, please. Wanted to give you just a brief overview in this diagram of sort of the pathway that PFAS enters various media. So in the sort of up right-hand middle of the diagram, you see industry, also commercial enterprises use PFAS compounds. They can be introduced either because they're used as a product to treat products that are being produced, or they may be used in processes during that process, or there may be PFAS compounds in equipment that are used in those processes. Those can be discharged either directly to surface waters or the ground through surface water or groundwater discharge permits, or they may enter collection systems and be transported to wastewater treatment facilities. In addition, there are PFAS sources that result from residential use. Again, certain products, fabrics, you know, around the house items that can introduce PFAS, which again may be introduced through the collection system into wastewater treatment facilities. These treatment facilities can discharge effluent containing PFAS directly to water bodies or the ground. And also the sludge that is produced from these processes may contain PFAS. Then PFAS, or residuals rather, is then either disposed of through incineration or through landfilling, or may be reused as a land application for fertilizer. All of these pathways potentially present the ability for PFAS compounds to get into drinking water. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you just a little bit of overview of the residuals program. So residuals is kind of a broad term. We'll use multiple terms in the discussions that we have. The definition that we've taken from the regulations says that sludge means the solid, semi-solid, and liquid residue that results from a process of wastewater treatment or drinking water treatment. And it excludes certain impurities or components that may be eliminated at the headworks of a treatment facility. These sludge products are generated from wastewater treatment plants, drinking water treatment plants, the processing of paper, and some other industrial processes, including the manufacturing of gelatin and cotton, and the cultivation and processing of cranberries, which there is great amount produced in Massachusetts. Residuals refers also to materials, sludges that have been treated or which just naturally meet pathogen standards that have been established by DEP in our regulations. And the term biosolids is specific to wastewater treatment plant residuals that meet those pathogen standards and are being used for land application as a source of fertilizer. Boards of health need to approve the use of land application in the Commonwealth unless those materials are coming from out of state. And these materials are used or sold or distributed for reuse in the Commonwealth. And we'll talk in a moment about the way that they get distributed throughout the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. Okay, so in 2018, there was a Massachusetts sludge survey and 122 sources that were reported indicated that they produced that year 180,800 dry tons of residuals. 43% of that was incinerated, and 18% was landfilled, and more than a third, or 38%, was land applied for reuse, with only 1% being used for having other forms of disposal. So we're talking about a significant amount of material that is being land applied, and as we've talked about a little bit, regulation of PFAS has potential to affect this portion of this methodology for reuse. Next slide, please. Okay, and so we're going to use some terms as well. We want to introduce to you some of the regulatory classifications. Seeing a clarifying question on the chat, so I think we're going to hold clarifying questions momentarily, and we'll pick those up as we change speakers, I believe. So types of residuals, a type 1 residual is approved by MassDEP. It's equivalent to an EPA Class A biosolid. It is used to grow any vegetation, and it does not require any further approval by MassDEP to be prior to being land applied. In contrast to a type 2 approval, which requires, after approval by DEP, requires site-specific approval to grow any vegetation, and it's equivalent to an EPA Class B biosolid. There's also a class named type 3s. They are limited to growth of vegetation that does not include food chain crops, and require that if land application occurs, it must be approved, and land application, record of land application must be recorded at the Registry of Deeds. We currently have no type 3 residuals products that we've approved in Massachusetts. So for the purposes of our discussions, we won't be really treating that issue further. Next slide, please. This is just a diagram of the pathways that for approval that I've just described. So on the left-hand column, you see type 1 pathogen, you see type 1 residuals which meet pathogen requirements. They also meet the standards for metals and PCB requirements. The list of metals they're required to meet standards for is to the right on your screen. And these type 1 residuals can be used without further approval by MassDEP. In the middle column, you see type 2 residuals. They meet pathogen requirements. They also meet standards for metals and PCBs, but they do require land application requirements prior to being placed on a specific site. And currently, again, we have no type 3 residuals in Massachusetts, those that are restricted from being used for the growth of food chain crops. Next slide, please. The availability of residuals for type 1 is they're widely available. They can be picked up at treatment plants or purchased from retail stores, garden centers, and online. Homeowners, other people doing gardening can readily obtain them and not have to experience any further approval. Type 1 and type 2 approvals are used in landscaping, dairy farms, animal feed farms, tree farms, produce farms, and golf courses. Next slide, please. Okay. We have 31 of these. AOS refers to approval of suitability. That's the term that we use for the permits that approve residuals in Massachusetts. We have 33 AOS holders, and in 2019, they produced 120,000 dry tons that were approved as type 1 residuals in Massachusetts. We had 3 AOS holders that produced 20,000 dry tons of type 2 residuals. And I want to just make a comment about a slide you saw earlier regarding the 2018 survey. You may have noticed that the dry tons in those two slides don't add up to the same figure, so I just wanted to take a moment to explain the differences. The 2018 survey was conducted for sludge producers in Massachusetts, and so that total tonnage, which was 180,800 dry tons, was the amount of sludge being produced by those 122 sludge producers in Massachusetts. This slide indicates that these AOS holders, we took information that we received from their annual reports and summed it to see how much we have. Adds up to about 140,000 dry tons. This includes entities which may produce sludges out of state, but yet land apply them in state. So that's the reason for those differences in the total quantities that you saw from the earlier slide. Next slide, please. Okay, land application certificates. These are for type 2 approvals, as we've mentioned. There were 6 properties in Massachusetts in 2019 that used type 2 approvals. The applications that they make to DEP provide us with certain information, and we review that information and the appropriateness of applying a type 2 residual to a particular site or particular piece of land based on some characteristics such as soil, the slope, pH, seasonal high groundwater, and whether there are drinking water sources that are nearby. These land application certificates for type 2 residuals are valid for 1 year, so they would need another approval if they're land applying again in a coming year, in a following year. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the MassDEP residuals regulations are located at 310 CMR 32. If you find that you need, further information about how that program works, you may want to consult that set of regulations or talk to any of us in the program who can help to answer questions and help explain those to you. This set of regs was created in the 1990s, about the same time that EPA biosolids regs were being developed. And they were last updated in 2016 when we revised the molybdenum labeling requirements. The residuals are subject to these approvals of suitability that I mentioned, which is the term we're using for permits for the use, sale, or distribution in Massachusetts. We make the type determination, and the AOS term is 5 years with an opportunity to renew. Next slide. Okay, do we want to take the questions from chat now, or are we going to do that after our next speaker?
Yeah, Lealdon, I think it's Stephanie. I think it might be helpful if you want to take a quick look at Shayna's question. I think was really just trying to clarify a comment you made. And while you're looking at it, I just want to note, I recognized in the participant list that a couple of other people who have joined that I want to recognize. We have Vandana Rao with us, who is the Director of Water Policy for the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. We also have Tiffany Skogstrom, who is the Acting Director of the Office of Technical Assistance at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And we have Deirdre Desmond, a lawyer from our Office of General Counsel, who has worked a lot on residuals issues. So I just wanted to recognize some more of my state colleagues who have joined the meeting and thank them for being here. And then I'll pass it back to you, Lealdon, if you want to read Shayna's question.
Sure. Hi, Shayna. So Shane is asking about the slide that I had that indicated the manufacturing of gelatin, cotton, and cranberries could be a source of PFAS in the environment. She asks if they are classified as sludge. I believe they're classified as the broad category of residuals. And we know that these, I believe we know that these are instances that could contain PFAS as a component of that residual product. Okay, are there any further questions or clarifications needed before we move on?